Hello everyone, today a very compact video about the Ulai River battle dating to 1120 BC. There were other battles of the Ulai River, telling the truth, the more famous ones later on, the most important in the 7th century BC. This one, however, has particular importance. Basically, it marked the end of the Middle Elamite period. It was an important victory by Nebuchadnezzar I, Nabu-khudurri-usur, if you really want to spell it the right way. That was driven also by a very serious reason for the Babylonians. That was the fact that the Elamites had stolen the great statue of Marduk, had brought it in Susa, their capital, and essentially the Babylonian ruler committed himself to recover it successfully. This was, however, closely fought battle. There was also a previous attempt, essentially a failed and aborted campaign. You know what the picture here is, right? We are in a pretty dramatic moment, generally speaking. This is the period, so-called the Bronze Age crisis of some sort. There is a huge debate whether it was broader collapse, some say, whether it's something, say, more articulated. I'm not going to digress on this, but it's an important phase of instability. The Elamites under Shutruk-nahhunte had exploited the collapse of the Babylonian Kassite dynasty. That was the ruling one from 1531 to, in fact, 1157, to invade Babylon, taking away Marduk's statue. This Marduk is, as you know, the central deity in the Babylonian religion. There is also about this, so back in time, a huge historiographical debate of what exactly this deity was, how it originated, whether it was, a divinity of the underworld or of the waters or the storm, etc. I'm not going to digress. Doesn't matter how interesting it is, telling the truth. The religious background to this, if you want, we can start talking. We will hopefully start talking about history of religions, mythology soon too. As you know, I have actually a very universalistic kind of interpretation regarding most deities, etc. But this was like the biggest deal, right? Marduk's statue constituted the very spirit of the Babylonian identity, right? The fact that it had been stolen, something, traumatically indescribable for these people. The same morale of the Babylonians was shattered, but of course they were motivated at least by revenge and getting the statue back, because it was a big deal for the Elamites as well. So it's important to introduce the characters. If anything, the battle is, if you want, quite simple. We have just those few informations. Of course, we cannot profitably reconstruct it. We will talk a bit about how the Babylonians and the Elamites fought in general, but we do not know about, say, the formation, etc. It's just very few things, and all the rest is speculation. As you know, I have a Bronze Age warfare playlist that I've been filling from a couple of years, and we will talk more in depth about the Babylonian and the Elamite way of war. We still haven't really dealt with them. Doesn't matter how relevant the Babylonians were in the history of civilizations. We do not know too much about their warfare. We think that it was fundamentally very similar to the one of the Assyrians, that actually were part of their auxiliaries initially. So we know mostly about the end of the period through the Assyrian sources. About Babylonian warfare, we're probably in the evolution of their stories, so sort of quite similar. After all, the Elamites were a bit wilder, right? They had this, they dwelled basically in the Iranian, southwestern Iran. They had actually been mostly allied with the Babylonians and against the Assyrians. But in this moment of upheaval, the end of the Kassite dynasty, again, things had sort of switched. Now, Nabucodonosor the first was a king of the second dynasty of Isin. He ruled over the Neo-Babylonian Empire from 1125 to 1104, and he was known essentially for his military conquests, expanding the empire's territories, defeating the Elamites, like in this circumstance, crushing away the Kassites, the Aramaeans. We talk about the latter, as a matter of fact, made a video about the Aramaean warrior that can't give you an idea of these guys were also not quite a pleasant meeting, just in that context. This was a very unstable situation where borders were extremely permeable. The political stability was pretty much resting on those various cities that, yes, could last, but also Poliorcetic was not particularly advanced. So, basing oneself on major crisis, the surplus was also ridiculous. So, even if a harvest failed, the situation could engulf itself. These cities were, to some degree, even in their defense on their own. There were these warlike nomads coming out of the desert, ravaging the crops, etc. So it is mostly the situation. Nabucodonosor, however, is one of those guys who got it right. He established essentially his dominance over Mesopotamia. And additionally, he would rebuild the city of Babylon, making the capital de facto of the empire, a major cultural and civil center, and he's considered one of the most successful, influential rulers of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Then we go back also in the original Babylonian Empire at some other point, but here we're just describing the characters, right? The Kassite dynasty we just mentioned would rule. We've seen was ruling essentially from the 16th to the 12th century BC. They had originally been a group of people originating from the Zagros Mountains and eventually establishing themselves as rulers of Babylon. There's some sort of, dynamics repeating itself. Look about the Achaemenids, just even think about the later Persian rulers and their relation with the more advanced Mesopotamia and so on. The Kassite dynasty had collapsed, right? We are not entirely sure how or why, but definitely just the fact that Marduk's statue had been stripped by the Elamites right out of Babylon itself, it speaks volumes about the degree of collapse of the generation. There was surely some internal weakness, likely due to lack of political cohesion, struggle for power within the same Kassite faction, pressure naturally that was incoming as soon as this crisis kicked in from the Assyrians, the Elamites, and a general instability that, as we have seen in this period known as the Bronze Age collapse, where several civilizations and empires across the Mediterranean, Anatolia, and the Levant declined dramatically, and can be seen as a broader background of this. All right. So, speaking of the Battle of the Ulai River, that is really few information we'll see now. The background is mostly fascinating because there had been a first campaign in which Nabucodonosor had invaded Elam to get the statue of Marduk back, and he had reached the Uknu, that is modern-day Kerka River, where in Mesopotamia essentially the Elamites controlled still the part of the same towards today's southern Iraq, Kuwait, and the boundary with Iran. These were sort of lesser developed people from the mountains that, however, were highly flexible. They had been raiding, as we've seen, the same Babylon, but the more advanced sanitary civilization. And we're so close, however, with it that there was a degree of superimposition, of overlapping, and synchrosis and similarity. And so this battleground is mostly actually within the Mesopotamia proper, where these various cities existed, but rivers, and this was a big deal in Babylonian warfare, because the Babylonians exploited terrain particularly well, not just from a tactical but also a strategical point of view, that would provide with in this first operation with an important defensive boundary for the Elamites. And it was very important, as you understand, to follow the course of major waterways, because you can't make an army work otherwise. And in this sense, the routes of advance were sort of more predictable. And there were different options, but the main deal actually about this, which may have been caused by the season, rather the colder one, I don't think we have an explicit evidence of that, but since the later campaign was actually carried out in summer, where actually heat conditions were extreme, as we will see, but when things went better from the hygienic point of view, we can appreciate, in fact, that this might, as the cause of the plague that broke out this first expedition in the Babylonian camp before the arrival of the Elamite army that, despite the Babylonians were being on the offensive, were prompted, given the foe's positioning, to counterattack. Even before this plague broke out, right? And the thing, in fact, sort of reversed, because the Babylonian army was decimated by this illness. It lost practically its cohesion, and it fled in disorder. In this process, Nebuchadnezzar himself almost lost his life. This must have been terrifying from a moral point of view, meaning that you're going to fight against what you deemed as an inferior culture that, however, managed to steal essentially the only essence of your power. Marduk's statue was really felt as a very close presence. The temple where the statue was preserved was really felt just of course, in very layered ways, very close to the entirety of the Babylonians. Power, including military one, and especially military one, would arrive. There are countless literary examples of Babylonian rulers literally committing themselves to Marduk, and with this ultimate purpose of maintaining the empire, etc. So it's a dramatic situation, right, for the Babylonians themselves. And Nebuchadnezzar almost loses his life entirely in the process. The fact that the Elamites followed the route closely tells us that still there was some cohesion in the Babylonian army, and that this was in fact capable of pulling out without complete disaster. And in this, probably Nebuchadnezzar had an important role as a commander that highlights that in order to keep things together. That highlights his qualities, definitely, of leadership. These people were considered a big deal, right? We are in the Bronze Age. These rulers are literally felt to be semi-divine themselves, having a privileged, of course, connection with the divinity in this case, especially with Marduk, with a sort of with this primary task of reachieving Saint Marduk's power by recovering himself in the same way, right? His name was Akkadian. It means literally, "Oh, Nabu protects my firstborn son." Nabu was Mesopotamian deity, and specifically the god of writing and wisdom, that is the son of Marduk, right? So there is a connection there with the sacred royalty. Made a video about that as far as the Sol Invictus was concerned. The mother was Sarpanit. It's a great mother, right? The wife of Marduk, and that in this sense probably had acquired, in spite of his origins that, as we were saying before, are very debated, a very important central role, surely, of celestial nature, and of course, as we've seen, of imperial one as well, right? So this first Babylonian expedition into Elam, right, it brought the war back into the enemy territory, as far especially as the most important centers controlled by these people in southern Mesopotamia was concerned, but it failed so disastrously. But not completely, right? Babylonian power was, after all, still preserved, and the Elamites had not had the capacity of simply pushing forward and destroying, annihilating Babylonian power entirely. It could have changed a lot of things, but probably they didn't have the capacity. So this prompted, back at home, a religious procedure for ensuring, for the next campaign, that was necessary. Marduk's statue had to be recovered anyway. A careful waiting for the obtaining of favorable omens from the divinity. And in this, of course, Nabucodonosor was crucial, because not just he was a medium of the divinity, but in this sense he had been the one who had initially failed, and so had been tested even further, and it was relevant for him to still be in power. So there was a connection there, could not be let go. The purpose of these rulers' existence was just to fulfill their own destiny as destiny makers themselves. And as long as they were still standing, of course, they didn't have a choice, especially after this shame, right? It had not been Nebuchadnezzar's fault whether Marduk's statue had been stolen initially, but having come into power, he had now the obvious duty of recovering it. Consider that, of course, all these Mesopotamian cultures had their own deity. Let's say every local community had its own deity that was, of course, part of a sort of an atheistic concept, for which, of course, there is a major one, but to a degree that was expressed by these greater rulers. I mean, Marduk was preeminent because the Babylonians were in charge at that point as a greater power, and yet there was a fierce competition between the forces that the same universal order was made of, and so the various political ups and downs that we were describing before were essentially mirroring this continuous rivalry, also as far as the local divine forces were concerned. The degree of divine force, right? If you didn't have a single empire, it was because Wu had, even the bigger one, did not have a complete control over the others, which means that the others had still some parts of the divinity that was working for them in that competition. And the entire point of this was to boost further some greater compactness and power, and so to come back to the one in achieving absolute power. It was a ruthless thing. I mean, they would destroy each other's deities because, of course, they saw that as the capacity that their own god would be able to provide, right, to essentially destroy, but absorbing the power of the destroyed. So everything fit in this nice little game. Was fierce in terms of religious-driven violence, of course, and it was basically all what these people thought about all the day long. So finally, Nebuchadnezzar obtained favorable omens from the gods, and he led a second expedition into Elam. So again, you can imagine all the auxiliaries, their own gods, siding, of course, with Nebuchadnezzar into this. And at this point, the Babylonians succeeded in taking the city of Der in the south of Mesopotamia on the Tigris, right? This was particularly important because the city is just the fact that the river is it was a defense for the Elamites, and it was important, of course, for the same Babylonians, first place to arrive there. Now, the only problem about the second expedition was that it was carried out in the height of summer, which in southern Iraq is not really the best of climates in general, and at least in that case, I hypothesized before that the first season was fresher, at least for some reason, first expedition season. I mean, at this point we know instead that temperature was extreme. The Babylonian soldiers and horses were said to have suffered terribly from thirst and heat exhaustion. The road was, quote, scorched like flame, according to source, and their march was pretty long, right? Over 300 kilometers, up to the river Ulai, so that gives the name to the battle. That is the modern Karun one. This is important because it shows, of course, Babylonian power, the fact that this was a massive expedition, at least a serious one of a regional scale, and they needed to follow the course of important waterways, again, especially in this extremely hot weather. We see here, of course, the importance of horses. We are at the end of the Bronze Age. Cavalry, as you know, as such, has not kicked in as an arm, but chariot warfare is still pretty well alive, and that's what dominates. You start seeing actually cavalry units, but not quite a cavalry arm as a whole, like mostly supporters of chariots on horseback, etc. I talk about this in some other videos. If you check my Bronze Age playlist, Bronze Age warfare playlist, I recently made pretty say moments close to the events, right? We talked about this end of the second, beginning of the first millennia. That is a very fascinating time, in my opinion, if anything, because I know better the Iron Age, and so being the closer to this part of the Bronze one, they overlap depending, of course, of what chronology you wanna adopt. But it does sort of make, of course, a lot of sense. I made videos about the Hurrimitanian war chariots, as I was saying before. We talk about not the Arameans, but we have to talk about them as well. In any case, we discussed also the Assyrian chariot of 9th century BC would have not been dramatically different from the ones that were used by the Babylonians at this time. We talk about the Neo-Hittite army organization, starting from the same 12th century. So we have outlined more or less for the Babylonian neighbors some kind of basics that you can use to explain this, say, how important chariot warfare would be. And the Babylonians, of course, were basically among the most, together with Egypt, in the sanitary world, like those who make sort of the best use of that, right? They had a greater assets. We've seen how much chariot warfare actually cost, and in fact, only these greater powers could afford true large drilled, well-equipped units of chariots, right, to carry out literally an imperial policy, right? Of course, chariot warfare was present even in the smaller tribes at this point, but let's say, given that it dominated warfare, the larger scale collective training and the resources needed to keep up with that were up to this major states in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and that's the point. Which also highlights, in this case, how, as it would happen, that the Babylonians were expecting the Elamites to fight back. The Elamites were famous actually for their chariots. That were actually, let's say it better, we're just taking a decent shape to this point as a broader arm. It was somehow more backward technically. They also used donkeys, etc. But they had an important firepower that was enhanced by an important amount of archers. It seems that most of their armies were very large, right? At some point, surely tens of thousands of men. and most of them were infantry archers, right? So this made these armies actually quite dynamic. We do not hear too much about Elamite heavy infantry, which, as we will learn now, of course, must have been there for. So, I mean, there would be no reason why there would have not been. But surely was a less, say, regular in nature than the Babylonian one. I suspect here the Babylonians actually had a higher military standards as far as the foot was concerned. The point about the Elamites being, as we've seen, being raiders and having this foot into civilization, but still having guerrilla fighters coming from the Iranian plateau, were sort of looser and yet more dynamic. So it was more difficult, of course, for the heavier army of civilization to simply chase these guys back. But of course, when these guys had descended from the mountains and occupied certain cities in Mesopotamia, etc., they had to play the same game of the locals, right? And as such, the Elamites the Babylonians were stronger. And the Battle of Ulai is in part proof of a testament of this, even though, of course, we have to think this major engagements to have always been historically more balanced, right? Always remember, the bigger the engagement, the more balanced the odds in warfare. That's always the case for many reasons. I can't quite digress. You can find you can find them in the von Clausewitz series, right? As far as the Babylonians are concerned, however, again, we know that they had this pretty standard sort of advanced Bronze Age army, and that they practiced, they had important ways of war, like as we've seen before, exploring also the terrain, having amphibious troops to be able to sort of bypass that whenever the enemies would essentially carry out the same. At some point they did suffer defeats as well in that fashion. Apparently there were engagements in which elite troops were able to pass the swamps in Mesopotamia, like especially in this southern context, that, as you know, it's pretty marshy. Some camps were established to defend themselves. Elite forces that, however, at this time were not particularly heavy, so they could perform in this tactical roles, right? Heavier troops in a swamp in later civilizations would have not been the best, but since they had the archers' cover, they could surpass, in this case, the difficulty, right? Just the bows could shoot in that single instance across the swamp itself, because the distance, of course, was not that high, and this sort of stormtroopers tactics would work at that level. So Bronze Age warfare is much more dynamic at a lower level because it's more balanced, and the armies are smaller just per se, so you have more unpredictable tactical outcome, right? Even when we talk about civilization, it was less stable, so also the so-called barbarians or this lesser developed civilizations were kind of had a greater chance to make it. But I'm talking in very general terms. We know, however, that this campaign was carried out in another season, and also the theater, because this time the Babylonians had decided to strike in a more northern position than of the Elamite territory than they had done previously, further south. And this was, we do not know too well now the strategy, how the Elamite forces were concentrated, whatever. There was also from the Babylonian side in this area always a sort of predatory, devastatory purpose, and the times were pretty standard in many ways. But we know that the Elamites were caught completely by surprise, at least apparently to a source, And they therefore hurried up to battle, and that's where the Ulai engagement took place. Just like actually last time, as we've seen, the Babylonian invasion had prompted the Elamites to just gather troops and confronting the enemy rather than just seeing it destroy the entire, leaving the initiative and wearing them out and damaging the territory, etc. So this was also the behavior, but apparently with less preparation, or at least, with some hurry and surprise, right? So the Elamite king at this point was Hulteludish-Inshushinak, right? Names of the time and the places. And he gave battle, decided to fight the Babylonians on the banks of the Ulai River, where they had also followed. All right. So we can imagine. We do not know much about the battle in the first place, but we can imagine, of course, one side of the battlefield being delimited by the river. The two armies raised these clouds of dust because the weather was so hot, as dry. The forces were large, and so the story goes that the sunlight was basically obscured, and so these troops fought in a condition of semi-darkness that also with general dust increased confusion, lack of visibility, etc. So this may be poetic, but up to a certain point. We can't really imagine. We have it from so many different accounts throughout old military history, of course. Clouds of dust being quite of a problem for fighters in the first place. And this battle seems to have been pretty ferocious and messed up. In fact, also because of this factor. So, may sound disappointing, but that's literally how much we know about the battle in itself. That the battle was won by a charge of the right flank Babylonian territory, led by a Babylonian border lord known as Lakti-Marduk. You hear here the connection between the rulers and the divinity. In this case, Lakti stands for Lap-Aptus will, so it literally means that this sort of martyr lord was given. We can imagine his more military mansions on the empire's frontier would be sort of imbued with the same divinity, right? You love Marduk so much, and you sort of are thirsty of him, and as such, basically these guys were sort of being possessed by the deity, as always, and in this holy combat that the battle would sublimate, right? And so here the guy goes really for the for the glory. Actually, this was under Nabucodonosor's command. So Marduk was, if anything, operating through his force, through the leader. But overall, right, the merit of this was also in the force of this other lord. Now, the interesting aspect about this chariot charge is that Lakti-Marduk, its commander, had actually lost contact with Nebuchadnezzar and main force during the battle. Right? We do not, again, know anything about the actual formation. We can think here that if you look at the Babylonian right coming from the north, this guy was attacking the Elamite, of course, left flank, and the opposite side of the battlefield would have the river. So this actually rings immediately a bell to any military historian. The idea was a flank attack against an enemy that could, at that point, not flee, because it would push towards the river, and so the objective was to pushed these guys either back or against in the water, given the enemy vectors, in order to drown, right? And it would have not been so strange. That's likely how it happened if we do not have that specific detail, right? But it is somehow fascinating that this Lakti-Marduk had allegedly lost contact with the same Nebuchadnezzar. So we do not know how many forces were involved. We can imagine at least in the thousands from both sides, possibly even more. And again, we hang on just single words. We do not know what the hell happened precisely. There is no way to find out. But the fact that Lakti-Marduk was at the head of the right flank Babylonian territory makes us think that it was not simply a minor party or a concealed reserve or whatever, but he had been in charge, in fact, of one sector of the battlefield in front of the Babylonian right. He had managed to crush into the Elamite chariots and destroying them, because warfare at that time, again, was about chariots in the front, spearheading, crashing, therefore, into one another. The Babylonians had, we know, better chariotry in general than the Elamites. They were sort of more primitive than that, and possibly the latter did not have, in fact, so much stopping infantry, like cavalry. Chariotry was dominating, right? It would have surely been some horsemen around, but without any consistency. And therefore it would have been very easy for Lakti-Marduk to have crushed just the entire formation in front of him, like the entire sector of the Elamite line in front of him, and not to have met much resistance. Once the Elamite chariots were broken, the rest of the infantry would have been quickly routed. At that point, we do not know how Lakti-Marduk operated, how distant, given that we're told that he lost sight with Nebuchadnezzar's main army, so main force, rather. I think the center of the battle line. It would have been a left one as well, or maybe not. Right? We do not know this exactly. But we can imagine, especially if the river was on the Babylonian left, the Elamite right, is that there may have been just a big center there frontally fighting without another outer wing, and that these guys on the Babylonian right and the Elamite left were to crush into each other to eventually outflank the enemy, as it happens at this point. Now, carrying out a charge in an orderly, effective fashion against the enemy after you have carried out another one, especially in the second millennium BC with chariots, it's not a child's play. I guess that it was not something unusual anyhow. In any case, the fact that it was successful, that these chariots had the capacity maybe to reform, or maybe have even just the capacity of simply turning against the enemy center at that point, having outflanked it en masse, right? That's also a valid tactic without, grouping in an orderly line formation. Still does require some important control, cohesion. This Lakti-Marduk was a good commander himself, evidently. And so we can imagine the Elamites having been smashed from the flank while they were engaged in the front, and just being truly annihilated. In fact, we do know that the Elamite king Hulteludish-Inshushinak died in the Battle of Ulai. This was a heavy blow. Likely, again, the guy either stood his ground and fought to the death. There is always, even when there is a mass rout at the end of the battle, always a unit that sort of stands his ground till the last and allows the others to escape more safely. And these guys, as we said, had sort of divine ambition, so the idea of simply fleeing was too humiliating, right? To live on, especially now that such major invasion had occurred, and so that basically all your political stakes were in this fight. And so it does make sense, even though we do not know the circumstances of the Elamite king's death specifically. Again, the fact that the river was closed, the fact that probably the Elamite army was crushed against it, may make us think even that, I don't know, these guys tried to flee, to escape with their armor, etc. They drowned, dismounting from their chariots that, of course, they couldn't bring across water, and that everything was as messed up, as confused. But we have to imagine that pretty concretely. Now, this was a hell of a victory for Nebuchadnezzar that, as we were saying before, marched eventually on Susa and recovered the statue of Marduk. Right? This is crucial. Susa was sacked, so there was a lot of Babylonian revenge in there, and Nebuchadnezzar returned in triumph to Babylon, repersonating Marduk's statue in its usual abode, right? And this made, of course, of Nebuchadnezzar a national hero, because he had first failed but then redeemed himself. He had managed to redeem the sins of the Kassites, and as such, he passed on to history as the pious avenger of Babylonia. This triumph and the successful return to the statue to the city was a momentous event in Babylonian history, so much so that several literary works were created to commemorate it, possibly including an early version of the famous Enuma Elish. Right? We'll talk about these things at some other point. So we have delineated, after all, a pretty normal, right, pretty usual Bronze Age warfare campaign and battle. Right, we see a major power that basically collects its forces as it has to regain control in some peripheral areas. In this case, there is the extra. There are always extras, right? Every campaign, every battle is unique in many ways, and it goes over to these territories that still are controlled by a people that is sort of, emerging into civilization, but has sort of more primitive background, and there is some important degree of syncresis between the two. The Elamites, in this case, as we've seen, had been auxiliaries of the Babylonians against the Assyrians, by the way, so they had gained their own military experience in Babylonian service, and that the battle is fought within a typical strategic context, right? There are these armies advancing to a certain point, devastating the enemy territory. Next, following the river course because of logistical reasons, there are all the environmental difficulties of the case. The Elamites can simply sit duck there, because if the Babylonians are carrying out their operations, their control of the area will vanish anyway. So they put together their forces for battle. They reach the Babylonians. They give battle. We do not know exactly who began what, how agreed, negotiated this battle really was. It's a pitched battle. It's a big deal. We do not know how many forces there are there, but the battlefield seems large enough, with some important tactical complexity that we can't fully observe, if not in this alleged loss of control of a chunk of a wing, fundamentally, of the Babylonian army, likely having fought in a distant enough place from the center against an enemy in the front, and likely a flank attack, and that squeezes the enemy eventually against the river. And we can imagine most of this is again, just attempted reconstruction. That's basically all we know. But from the sources of the time, but it all makes sense strategically, tactically. The consequences are also evident, that the Elamites are really destroyed, their leaders killed in combat, and or at least in during the pursuit, and the we don't know how actually. We know the guy got killed, and I think in the battle, such. Yes, in the battle proper. At least in the maybe in the aftermath, we do not know, but in the immediacy, let's say, at least of his army being destroyed, and we see Susa as an important center, controlled by Elam from this Iranian plateau background that illustrates how, again, what we were saying before, that these mountain peoples were sort of trying to update to gain their space within a more developed context, forming a basis on this powerful city center. And so there is the vengeance with Marduk statue that was sort of that had immediately won the battle, right, and that had elevated the same ruler, if you want, to savior, so to an unprecedented prestige after a failure caused by the lack of the statue, very importantly enough. There is all a metaphysical dimension here going on. Again, we do not have other details about the affair, but we can easily understand essentially how all this fits a normal pattern, and you can almost see the battle, even though we know so few about, generally speaking, both Babylonian and Elamite warfare. Okay, not too few, but even in iconographic archaeological terms, we're not too rich in that. We just, however, can see that things did not really change too much from different times and places around this, so we have an idea of what this combat would have been about. We understand chariot warfare was still there and having its usual relevance. We can imagine infantry having played an important role anyway, and both in the heavy and in the light missile component. The chariots naturally had some sort of specialization in that regard. I mean, there were lighter ones that were sort of thought to be less smashing and more hitting. In this late Bronze Age context, we can think, of course, of a dynamization of this local warfare to, at least in terms of arms integration, right? Chariots were getting heavier, but they're still importantly maneuverable, so infantry can participate in this fight, but it's still the chariots, as we've seen, that enter the battle. That end the battle with this attack on the flank. Surely infantry would have followed, but it's that shocked mobile attack that wins the day, even though with this is an important aspect. We do not know, apparently this interaction was not coordinated. Naturally, if you manage to win on a wing, unless you pursue the enemy, that may even carry out some tactics. Here the Elamites were sort of pretty lighter than the Babylonians, we think, at least stereotypically, but we have to think they were actually pretty similar in this context. But still, again, it's not to be given for granted that you can simply have the capacity, the command skills to gather troops after a successful charge and engagement, and having the force, the vision, the capacity of redirecting it against the enemy flank that is distant from here. So here, aside from Nebuchadnezzar, we have Lakti-Marduk, that is this secondary commander. We see he's a border lord, so he has seen his share of warfare. He is very much, given his name, committed to the cause spiritually, identitarily, and so on. That's command there. You don't have to give for granted that these chunks would actually make it, right? Obviously, you would think, well, if I crush one flank, I fall on the enemy center, right? Well, yes, so everybody would have expected that from any side, but your capacity circumstantially to do so is a completely different story, all right? So there is an element of randomness here. Plus, We can, however, imagine, given the fact of the detailed dust, right, the clouds, etc., that there was a capacity to spot where the fight was still raging, and it could have been still an indicator of troops there. Not necessarily, maybe the engagement would have ended. We do not know the timing here, but battles could be lengthy affairs, so we don't have to. And also, this army is being sort of dynamic on the move, so we don't have to imagine just per se again that certainty. Even saying, okay, I just broke the enemy, and even if I'm cool and smart, I can't simply now attack him on the flank. In the other chunk that is still fighting. It's all unknown, right? And you need, again, specific capacities and also progressed abilities from the troops, etc., to do that, right? Especially the chariot element would have, at that point, being the one you would rely on the most as the spearhead of the formation, the nobleman, fundamentally, the aristocracy at least, that would have been essentially the virtually professional force, right? They were the guys who were always out there because they had all invested in that business after all, and so the others were sort of following them in that. So this hierarchical dimension is also important because, again, also in the chain of command, you don't always have that capacity of regrouping, reforming, and being able to launch a successful attack against the enemy flank, plus coordinated with the rest of your force. This strategically speaking, is very relevant, right? For the rest, one has to be battle bits are usually more complex than this, but it could be our first Bronze Age battle, I think so, that's cool, and we have to get habituated to this as far as Bronze Age warfare is concerned, because it's not normal in the first place even to have the tactical information that we have for the Battle of Ulai here. We're talking 1120 BC, right? So it's shocking, and the fact that this is documented speaks also of the importance of the engagement, just per se, right? So the interest, right, of this battle is that by the mere fact of being documented tells us that after all there was some relevant connection, some important mark. Of course, this is of course about Nabu-khudurri-usur, also politically the fact again that Marduk's statue's retrieval was the single most important thing that could ever happen in the first place. So this is, eventually we've seen there was a lot of literature written about that. There were lots of other battles happening that we do not know much about in the first place, right? Maybe some were more political, even more military relevant, but literally we do not have the actual documentation for it, because it's just lost out there. And we have to imagine in this, especially crisis of the Bronze Age, lots of these engagements happening all the time. Like, I must say, for example, as a medievalist, specializing in the 13th, 14th century, that at that point you start actually seeing and documenting an enormous amount of the smaller engagements. That people often say, now the smaller engagements were essentially just siege warfare and important things. Pitched battles were so rare. I can't say that, but I call BS on that big time. There was plenty of smaller actual open field engagement with thousands of troops that even in the Middle Ages you just have a note in the chronicle. And when you look at ancient history, for example, you have just the major battles. They're usually at least speaking of Western history, well documented, well criticized, analyzed, if anything, because of our way of writing history since the Greeks. that also had their own ways of doing things, but that eventually beat all the other at the time. But if you look at that, you don't have much care for the smaller engagements, right? Classical literature is fixated with the main ones, or at least the works that talk about war in general, talk about lots of other stuff going on politically in a contextual sense. So that's why a single battle is, sort of the climax of a bigger deal. But in a strictly chronacistic sense, right, most of the smaller engagements were there exactly in the same way, by the way, and just they're not documented. And so if you don't see them for, say, classical times during, I don't know, the Punic Wars, we do know they were there. And if you look at the Bronze Age and you realize how few we actually know about that warfare, and the smaller engagements, even the bigger battles like these do not really have much more than a certain amount of information, well, you can easily understand the degree by which we actually do not know the whole picture, right? We get naturally that there is still a precedence, right, of some sort. Say if there is a big deal happening at this point, you have practically a greater chance, of course, of the battle being recorded, right? So history in this sense doesn't lie. People shouldn't be fooled by, say, when you say that we do not know the whole picture, it's because the whole picture is made mostly by many smaller things. But of course the big hits are normally recorded. And we are in the 12th century BC here, so we are lucky even just for the fact that there is an actual information about this. And you see, even the fact that we do not know the composition of the army, the actual battle formations, and so on, shouldn't upset us so much, because after all, warfare at the time was pretty notorious, right? As we try to explain today, yes, we can sort of stereotype, characterize these armies, considering what these single peoples were and tendentially, but remember that, again, the few information we have, especially for the Babylonians and the Elamites, means that the few that you have is going to characterize more your cognitive, is going to influence you, the categorization happening in your own cognitive process, right? So it may seem that these Babylonians were just hiding into swamps on the basis of what, or the Elamites just had weird chariots and had just infantry archers most. But in this context, right, they would have been pretty similar and pretty updated, pretty sort of, worth one another, if we can't say that. And this is an overlooked aspect. It's greatly, let's say, it's one of the things that we tend to forget because, again, we like to sort of, this is a typically modernistic mentality to make sense, rationalize everything, but eventually not even knowing what the hell is going on, right? And this is, I think, the most important side of the story, the most relevant. We do not need everything to be explicitated for us to actually know what the basics could have been if you have enough diachronic and comparative experience in the art of war, right? You can have a pretty good grasp of this, and going with it without too much, oh my God, who knows what I lost behind? It's the Bronze Age. You can't have lost too much in terms of what we know overall, which is still a lot, right? If you consider we have plenty of battles here. I can't go on for years just talking about Bronze Age warfare, making a video about it every day. So we're not scared. We talk about this just every once in a while. I'm by no means an expert in Bronze Age warfare. I know something, but it's just mostly about the single pieces that I sort of refine, carve out of the mold, and sort of refine for fruition online, and make disclosure basically. But once we will have covered enough of this, you already know that we've seen it, made lots of chariot types videos, for example, and we have already understood it doesn't matter how similar they were, they all point two directions in their changes, right, in their evolution, the fact that these were getting heavier over time, etc. There is all the development of cavalry proper. There had been the development of chariots. We will have to talk about that. I made a video about the origins of chariot warfare, but we will have, especially in the sanitary side, observe all the various documented sort of development from the Sumerians, etc. So it's all something that I do for the sake of completing the picture, so that if you have questions about, but how did this come to be, etc., you have the evidence, you have the material, and you can fundamentally go back to it and say, well, okay, this makes sense, this is useful, this is something I should have even thought, and preparing you to that idea, because it's true, I would like to expand also in other eras more, right? I focus on the Middle Ages, obviously, for practical reasons, but even with that, right, when you realize, what did we talk about yesterday? Medieval Irish warfare. I don't know how many medieval Irish warfare videos are already made, including the ones going back even in ancient Gaelic history and so on. The Latins said repetita juvent, which means what is repeating is helpful, right? It helps you memorizing, helps you understanding, helps you refreshing the awareness of what you're talking about, rather than seeing this stuff as pieces of a sort of random collection that just gives you the highlights. By looking at various different aspects every time, I'm not repeating myself really that much. You can form a glue that keeps this thing together and allows you to look at this topics without essentially being able to draw the connections on your own. And that's the thing that if I succeed in, I feel it's all worth making all this for, right? I don't have many other reasons aside. I can make some income. I can, actually I learned a lot myself through this. That's the main wealth that came back to me in many ways. The ability of expressing myself at least to some degree of effectiveness in order to explain this stuff. And you see, it comes sort of natural, even with sort of relatively, cursory topics, right? For example, today's topic. There's no that's another problem, but I don't have the copyrighted pictures to use. That there is not much in the first place actually about the Babylonians and the Elamites, even with copyright stuff. That this few information was not worth, say, making a picture telling you, well, this is exactly what happened. That's the only thing we know, and how it has happened it's not entirely clear. But this idea of, again, a Mesopotamian power that moves towards the more mountainous areas, crosses the Tigris, has, even manages, right, to crush the enemy entering to Susa and sacking it, right? It speaks of so a pattern that we have seen, say, in the videos about, Julian's campaign against the Sasanians in Mesopotamia. There are some similarities to it, right? There are patterns that repeat themselves. And it's fascinating because they're always practically the same. Again, the big centralized power against the sort of the rascals in the ghetto, fundamentally. Well, what can you do about that? The civilizations versus barbarism, or whatever you want to see this like. Agriculturalists versus shepherds. So in any case, that I am approximating, but still, right, there is a lot here that is boiling in the cauldron, in the pot, that is also the evolution of civilization through this warfare. And you see, in this case, a hell of an accomplishment by Nebuchadnezzar, and you want to appreciate the outcome. You want to appreciate how you're right there, and that's why essentially we make videos like these. For the rest, I'm continuing to say the cycle. The Bronze Age warfare comes every once in, I don't know, more than 1 month. But step by step, we made how much did we make? Bronze Age warfare, how many? I don't know whether it counts them, but it's not a few, in terms of it's becoming more varied. Only 19 videos. Well, come on, it's not that few overall, right? It's already something, right? When we'll have it double, you could say, well, have a pretty nice, interesting playlist on the topic. And what I take pride of is that nobody covers these topics. That's the interesting thing about this, is that surely nobody is gonna have any playlist like mine, because it's really unique. You may like or dislike it. It's not much of a big deal as such, but surely it's unique, right? We cover topics that no other does, and so I see here that I even get a relevant amount of views. If you look at these videos, like hardly any of these are sort of forgotten or unwatched, right? So it's fascinating, because I didn't plan it to pass for the Bronze Age warfare guy, but the more you go on, the more you're gonna sort of coming closer to something like this. But it's also a matter of how much you go on, how much you're willing to endure, whatever. I plan to go on with this, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.